20%. That was the survival rate for German flak gunners by the end of 1945. Only 1 in 5 men returned home. This statistic represents a mortality rate higher than the crews of the U-boat fleet. It was more dangerous than serving in the Panzer divisions. It was the deadliest assignment in the entire German military. These soldiers did not charge enemy lines or clear urban ruins with grenades. They stood in fixed positions behind heavy barrels pointed at the clouds. Why did this role become a death sentence? At first glance, a defensive position behind steel shields, but in reality, a target for thousands of tons of explosives. The air war over Europe changed the math of survival. Allied bombers didn't just drop payloads on factories and cities, they targeted the guns defending them. B-17, flying fortresses and Lancasters flew in massive formations. When the flak opened fire, the bombers retaliated with saturation bombing. Shrapnel from high-altitude bursts filled the air. Thousands of machine gun rounds from escort fighters swept the gun pits. There was nowhere to hide. The footage shows gunners frantically loading shells while explosions rocked the concrete towers. Metal splinters tore through uniforms, the smell of cordite mixed with the scent of burning oil. If a direct hit struck the ammunition pile, the entire battery vanished in a fraction of a second. The sound of whistling bombs was the last thing many heard. It got worse. As the Allied ground forces moved in, flak units were forced into a new role. They turned their 88mm guns away from the sky and toward the horizon. Now, they were facing Allied tanks at point-blank range. The guns were large and difficult to conceal. Once they fired, their position was revealed. Artillery fire followed immediately. The sound of incoming shells became constant. Soldiers didn't just die from direct hits. They died from collapsing bunkers, falling debris, and the sheer pressure of the blasts. By 1944, the Luftwaffe began using teenagers and elderly men to fill the gaps. The veterans were already gone. There was no turning back. By the final months of the war, flak batteries were being overrun daily. The gunners stayed at their posts until the very end. They loaded, aimed, and fired until the barrels overheated or the position was silenced. Thus ended the life of the average flak gunner. 1933. German military planners faced a threat they could not yet see. The Versailles Treaty was the obstacle. It stripped the nation of tanks, warplanes, and heavy artillery. Modern warfare was officially forbidden, but the reality on the ground was different. Behind closed doors, German industry ignored the treaty. Factories operated under cover stories to hide illegal production. Engineers drafted blueprints in secret rooms. Why the rush to rearm? It was not a fear of enemy infantry or tanks. The real danger was developing in the clouds. Air power changed everything during the First World War. By the 1930s, the technology reached a lethal breaking point. New strategic bombers were entering the sky. These machines cruised at altitudes where rifle fire could not reach. Light anti-aircraft guns were useless against them. A single squadron could now haul enough explosives to flatten entire city blocks in one pass. German planners watched the horizon. They studied the evolution of flight and realized their borders were wide open. The old defenses were obsolete. At first glance, Germany was a disarmed nation, but in reality, it was a laboratory for a new kind of war. The footage from that era shows the scale. Huge hangars, thousands of workers, the sound of metal striking metal. They weren't just building planes, they were building a shield. There was no turning back. They needed a weapon that could strike higher and harder than anything ever built. Events accelerated. The result of this fear would soon change the shape of the coming conflict. Thus began the secret race for the sky. 1933. German aviation technology was advancing, but the threat from above was growing faster. Allied bombers were flying higher and faster than ever before. Existing defenses were useless. How could the German military hit a target miles above the earth? They needed a weapon with extreme muzzle velocity. The high command turned to the engineers at Krupp. The process was not easy. Dozens of prototypes failed. Design revisions piled up on drafting tables. Finally, Krupp produced a winner. It entered service under a formal designation, the 8.8-centimeter Flak 18. The word Flak was not a name. It was a functional abbreviation for Flugabwehrkanone. or anti-aircraft cannon. Eventually, the term escaped the world of military jargon. It entered the English language as a common metaphor. Today, when someone says they are catching flak, they are using a term born in the fire of the Second World War. For Allied air crews, the word represented a physical wall of steel. What made this weapon a revolution in ballistics? It was the shell. The gun fired heavy projectiles at high velocity, but the secret was the fuse. Crews used adjustable time fuses. They calculated the altitude of the bombers and set the shells to explode at that exact height. A direct hit was not necessary. In the air, the shell detonated, spraying thousands of high-speed metal fragments in a wide radius. This shrapnel shredded aluminum wings. It smashed through engine blocks. It sliced through the thin skin of the fuselage, killing crew members instantly. The footage shows the results, clouds of black smoke filling the sky. Each cloud was a lethal zone. A direct hit vaporized a plane. A near miss tore it apart. The design of the carriage was equally important. The weapon sat on a cruciform, or cross-shaped platform. This allowed the gunners to traverse the barrel 360 degrees with ease. They could track fast-moving targets across the entire horizon. The elevation range was massive. The barrel could point nearly straight up into the clouds. It could also drop to just below the horizontal line. This flexibility was intended for aircraft, but this capability would soon serve a much darker purpose. The weapon was about to face a completely different kind of target. It was no longer looking at the sky. It was looking at the ground. 1936. The Spanish Civil War became a laboratory for German engineering. The High Command shipped a batch of 88mm guns to the front lines. They treated the conflict as a live fire exercise for the global war they knew was coming. The results caught everyone's attention, but it wasn't for the reasons the engineers expected. Why did the data surprise the analysts? At first glance, a weapon for the sky, but in reality, a predator of the ground. Engagement records told a strange story. Experts reviewed nearly 400 documented combat actions from the Spanish front. Only 30 involved aircraft. The vast majority of targets were bunkers, fortified walls, and enemy tanks. Armored vehicles of the 30s were thin. Most plating only stopped rifle rounds. A high-velocity anti-aircraft shell didn't just hit these tanks. It shredded the steel. It turned the crews inside into dust. But buried in those same records was a lethal detail. No one gave it enough attention at the time. The men operating these guns died at a staggering rate. Only fighter pilots suffered higher casualties. It was a suicide mission in plain sight. Events accelerated. By September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The scale of their arsenal was clear. They had assembled 2,600 heavy anti-aircraft guns. This was double the British inventory. The Americans had almost nothing. The command structure was specific. These weapons did not belong to the army. They fell under the Luftwaffe. The crews were not conscripts. They were career professionals. They spent months in specialized schools. They mastered complex targeting computers and mechanical dials. These systems made the gun effective. Without them, it was just heavy steel. There was no mistake. Over the next few years, German factories produced 21,000 88mm guns. Different versions rolled off the assembly lines. But the firepower came with a cost. The soldiers serving these batteries would pay for every shot with their lives. The footage shows crews working in the open, unprotected by armor. The sound of the breech slamming shut is the only warning before the recoil. The story cut off here. Thus began the era of the 88. 7,000 kilograms. This was the weight of the German 88mm gun. When deployed for action, the weapon stood over 2 meters tall. On the flat plains of the Eastern Front or the deserts of North Africa, it was impossible to hide. The silhouette was visible for miles. It was a massive target. How did the crews survive? In most cases, they did not. A full crew consisted of 11 men. German doctrine demanded high mobility, so the gun was towed behind a heavy half-track, but this speed came with a fatal flaw. Moving from travel mode to a firing position took a well-trained crew 2.5 minutes. The footage shows the process, men leaping from the vehicle. They unhook the wheel assemblies. They lower the heavy stabilizing jacks. They level the platform. Throughout these 150 seconds, the soldiers stood completely upright. They had no armor and no trenches. They were exposed to machine gun fire, shrapnel, and strafing aircraft. 2.5 minutes is a lifetime when Soviet T-34 tanks are charging across a field. It is even longer when ground attack planes are diving from the clouds. The machine required perfect coordination. One mistake stopped the battery. A commander identified the targets and shouted orders. 2 gunners sat on either side of the barrel. One controlled the horizontal traverse. The other managed the vertical elevation. They tracked targets through optical sights, fighting to keep the crosshairs steady. But aiming was only half the battle. 2 fuse setters worked near the breech. They adjusted the mechanical timers on the shells. If the timing was off by a fraction of a second, the shell exploded too high or too low. A loader slammed the 20-pound rounds into the block. 4 ammunition handlers formed a human chain, carrying heavy crates from the limber to the gun. The noise was deafening. The heat from the barrel was intense. The gun did not act alone. A separate 5-man team operated the commando turret. This was a complex mechanical computer. It calculated the range, speed, and altitude of enemy aircraft. The machine then sent these firing solutions to every gun in the battery simultaneously. The system was precise. It was also a death trap. One shell from an enemy tank could wipe out the entire 16-man section in an instant. There was no cover. There was only the gun. The casualty rates reflected this reality. 8.8 centimeters. That was the bore of the most famous weapon in the German arsenal. The machine functioned with mechanical precision, even under the pressure of intense combat. A dedicated crew of 10 men operated as a human computer. They tracked approaching bombers and measured 3 variables: speed, altitude, and course. How did they hit a moving target miles away? The math was complex. The crew had to predict where a bomber would be 20 seconds into the future. That was the time it took for a shell to reach high altitude. One mistake in the calculation meant the shell exploded in empty air. The muzzle velocity reached 2,700 feet per second. At this speed, the weapon engaged targets at 26,000 feet. But the power came with a risk. The pressure inside the barrel was immense. If the crew failed to clean the weapon or if the steel was worn, the barrel would rupture. Metal would shred the crew instantly. Maintenance was a matter of survival. The logistics were heavy. One projectile weighed nearly 10 kilograms. The complete cartridge, including the brass casing and propellant, exceeded 14 kilograms. Loaders had to lift these weights every 3 seconds during a raid. Inside the high-explosive round sat 1 kilogram of TNT. A thick steel jacket surrounded the core. The footage from the era shows dark, expanding clouds in the sky. These were not just smoke. One shell created 10,000 metal splinters. Upon detonation, the fragments sprayed across a killing zone of 15 meters. This shrapnel shredded aluminum aircraft skins and severed vital control cables. For the pilots inside, there was no protection. But there was a critical shortcoming. Why did the Germans struggle to down more bombers? The answer lies in the fuse. The Allies developed proximity fuses that detonated automatically when near an aircraft. The Germans failed to do this. They relied on mechanical time fuses until the very end of the war. The result was a lack of precision. Shells often exploded too early or too late. To compensate for this, the Germans relied on pure volume. The weapon featured a semi-automatic breech mechanism. It ejected spent casings and slammed the next round into the chamber automatically. A skilled crew maintained a rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The guns only grew larger as the war progressed. The military fielded 10.5 and 12.8 centimeter versions. These monsters fired shells weighing up to 26 kilograms. They packed triple the explosive power of the standard 88. The sky became a wall of steel and lead. The strategy was simple. If they could not be precise, they would be massive. This was the logic of the Flak batteries. 4 to 6 weapons. That was the standard battery. In critical industrial zones, the number grew. Formations expanded to 8 or even 12 heavy guns. Each weapon had a name from the German phonetic alphabet: Anton, Bertha, Caesar, Dora, Emil, Fritz. The crews became tight-knit. It was a necessity of war. Survival depended on every man performing his role. One mistake meant death for the entire group. The routine was relentless. Daily life centered on the weapon. Every hour was spent preparing for combat. Mornings began with a formal assembly. Next came equipment inspections. Barrel maintenance was the priority. High-intensity firing caused extreme wear on the steel. A worn barrel could explode. It would kill the crew instantly. Practice drills followed. Target exercises filled the afternoon. Then came the guard rotations. After the work came the waiting. This was the hardest part. Hamburg faced 778 separate air raid alerts during the war. Crews lived in rotating shifts. They were always on edge. Sleep was a luxury. Sirens broke the silence at any hour. The alarm sounded. The clock started. You had 2 minutes and 30 seconds. In that time, the crew had to bring the weapon to full firing condition. They stood at exposed stations. Above them, hundreds of bombers approached. The geography of the batteries was a trap. Commanders chose positions for the widest field of fire. This meant zero cover. Crews worked on rooftops and specialized concrete towers. They stood on elevated ridges and in open fields. There was nowhere to hide. The first shot gave everything away. Muzzle flashes and black smoke signaled the battery's exact location. The men were stationary targets. The pilots above could maneuver. The gunners could not. They had to stay. They had to keep the barrels hot while the bombs fell. Location changed everything. In German cities, the men had barracks. They had regular meals and a military routine. Life was stable at first. Then came North Africa. The heat was the first enemy. Metal became too hot to touch with bare skin. Crews dug sandpits to hide the guns. They fought a constant battle against dust. A small amount of grit would seize the firing mechanism. The Eastern Front offered no relief. Severe cold required special lubricants. Without them, the guns froze solid. Batteries used horse-drawn sleds to move equipment. Snow made wheeled vehicles useless. The environment was as lethal as the enemy. The war never paused for the weather. The crews simply adapted or died. May 1940. The ground war changed faster than the history books claim. It happened by accident. During the early campaigns, German crews faced a crisis. They encountered Allied armor that their standard weapons could not penetrate. The French deployed heavy tanks. The British sent Matildas. These vehicles carried thick steel plates. Germany relied on 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns. The rounds simply bounced off the hulls. The sound of metal hitting metal echoed across the fields. No penetration. Someone made a call for the 88s. These high-velocity shells did not bounce. They punched through armor that had stopped every other German projectile. This new approach proved its worth during the French campaign. The British launched a counterattack against Erwin Rommel's division. German light tanks could not hold the line. They began to retreat. The entire German position faced total collapse. Rommel acted. He gave a direct order to every anti-aircraft crew in the sector. Depress the barrels, aim at the ground, fire directly at the approaching tanks. The 88s stopped the British advance. The attack ended in minutes. German leadership watched the results. They realized their anti-aircraft weapon was now their most effective anti-tank tool. Rommel took this lesson to North Africa. He turned the weapon into a deliberate trap. June 1941, a location the British would later name Hellfire Pass. The desert heat was intense. German armor performed a fake retreat. They drew British tanks forward, deeper into the sand. Waiting for them were concealed 88 positions. The guns were dug into the desert floor, hidden from view. 13 guns faced 190 British tanks. The engagement began. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. 100 vehicles were destroyed. This included the heavily armored Matildas. These tanks were designed to survive conventional anti-tank fire. Against the 88, they were targets. The gunners were precise. They averaged 1 kill for every 20 rounds fired. The first wave of British tanks vanished. 11 vehicles out of a 12-tank formation were destroyed in the opening minutes. The British commander keyed his radio for a final message. He reported that a specific gun was tearing his squadron apart. Then his own tank exploded. A captured British crewman spoke to his captors later. He expressed disbelief. He argued that using anti-aircraft guns against ground targets was not fair. But the tactic worked. The 88 possessed a specific combination of velocity and range. These qualities applied perfectly to targets on the ground. The era of the heavy anti-tank gun had begun. 8 millimeters. This was the diameter that changed the rules of engagement. The weapon possessed a flat trajectory and extreme muzzle velocity. High-quality optical sights made it precise. On the Eastern Front, these technical specs became a necessity. Germany faced a crisis. Soviet T-34 and K-5 series tanks appeared on the horizon. Their sloped armor was a wall. Standard German anti-tank guns failed. The 37mm Pak-36 was the standard. It failed completely. German soldiers gave it a cynical nickname, the door knocker. They fired, the shell bounced off, and the enemy simply turned their turret toward the flash. It was a suicide mission. Why did the High Command rely on it for so long? They underestimated Soviet metallurgy. But the 88 was different. For months, it was the only German weapon capable of killing Soviet heavy armor at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. This wasn't luck. It was engineering. Specialized armor-piercing ammunition made the difference. These rounds were designed with a delay-action fuse. The shell punched through the steel plate first, then it detonated inside the hull. The explosion shredded the crew and ignited the fuel tanks. At a distance of 2 kilometers, the 88 could penetrate 100 millimeters of solid armor. No Allied tank in the entire war could survive that hit. But the transition was mental. It was a shift from the sky to the mud. Anti-aircraft crews were used to math. They looked at dials and calculated altitudes. The enemy was a speck in the clouds. It was clinical. It was distant. Ground combat changed everything. The footage from the front shows the reality. Now, the crews looked through the sights and saw faces. They watched the steel glow red. They saw the hatches fly open. They watched men crawl out of burning wreckage. There was no more distance. The targets were no longer dots on a grid. They were steel giants firing back with high explosive shells. Every tank on the field prioritized the 88 as target number 1. If you didn't kill them first, you died. The crews became the most hunted men on the battlefield. Snipers, mortars, and infantry all focused their fire on the high-profile gun shields. It was a trade-off. Extreme power came with extreme risk. German leadership saw the casualty reports. They knew they couldn't leave these guns stationary in open fields forever. The weapon was too valuable to lose. August 1942. The Tiger tank enters the battlefield. It carries a modified version of the 88mm gun. Allied tank crews learned to fear this weapon immediately. This fear lasts for the next 3 years. Other vehicles like the Nashorn and the Elephant carry even longer, more lethal versions of the barrel. These machines suffer from constant mechanical failures. Their engines overheat and their transmissions break. But the guns are different. Both Allied and German commanders agree. These are the best anti-tank weapons of the entire war. They can destroy a target from 2,000 meters away. At that range, return fire is physically impossible. Technology evolves. Some 88s receive heavy armor plating and tank tracks. But the war in the sky never stops. Static batteries remain trapped in fixed positions for air defense. By February 1945, the situation turns desperate. Over 300 heavy anti-aircraft batteries are moved. This represents 20% of Germany's entire inventory. They are no longer pointing at Allied bombers in the clouds. They are leveled horizontally against advancing Soviet tank divisions. The transition is brutal. Crews trained to track high-altitude targets now face armored assaults on the ground. The physical vulnerabilities remain unchanged. A standard battery requires 2.5 minutes to set up. During these 150 seconds, the crew is completely exposed. There is no armor. There is no overhead cover. Infantry can crawl through dead zones where the massive guns cannot aim. The footage shows the reality. Men stand in freezing mud outside Prague. They take direct mortar fire near Breslau. They are using high-altitude weapons against enemies they can see with the naked eye. July 1944. Normandy. A single incident reveals the internal collapse of the German command. An army major enters a village. He watches British armor bypass his position. He finds a surviving Luftwaffe 88 battery nearby. The major orders the battery captain to engage the tanks. The captain refuses. He states his mission is aircraft. He claims destroying tanks is a task for the Army, not the Air Force. The major does not argue. He draws his Luger pistol. He points it at the captain's head. The order is simple: open fire or die on the spot. The captain surrenders to the threat. The battery begins its work. By the end of the day, dozens of British tanks are burning in the fields. This confrontation highlights a massive systemic failure. These men serve the Luftwaffe, not the army. They follow different leaders and different rules. Many resist being pushed into ground combat. They are not trained for it. They are not equipped for it. They are forced to die in roles they never chose, commanded by officers from a different branch of service. The war began with total German air superiority across Europe. During that phase, the anti-aircraft crews faced very little danger. But the air grew crowded. The ground grew smaller. It got worse. 1943. This was the year the tide turned. The German air defense crews suddenly found themselves in a desperate fight for survival that would not end until the total collapse of the Reich. The Allies launched a campaign of non-stop bombardment. British heavy bombers dominated the night. American formations struck during the day. This created an unbroken cycle of fire and destruction. The scale of these raids was unprecedented. Over 1,200 aircraft targeted Dresden in a single wave. During a raid on Dortmund in March 1945, more than 1,000 planes dropped nearly 5,000 tons of explosives. Why did the Flak batteries become the only line of defense? The answer lies in the numbers from June 6, 1944. On the day of the Normandy landings, the Luftwaffe was broken. They flew only 250 sorties. On that same day, the Allies flew nearly 14,000 missions. The fighter protection once covering German airspace vanished. Only the Flak batteries remained on the ground. A gunner recorded his observations from a station in August 1944. The footage would show dark specks appearing in a clear blue sky. These clusters grew larger as they approached. The firing command echoed across the battery. It was round after round, volley after volley. This continued until the bombers passed out of range or the gunners were killed. But effectiveness began to drop. At first glance, the defense seemed strong. In reality, advanced Allied countermeasures were winning. During the early stages of the war, 4,000 shells were needed to down one bomber. By the end, that number climbed to 16,000. Radar jamming equipment degraded German fire control systems, but the volume of fire remained lethal. Allied losses continued to mount despite the technical advantage. Hundreds of aircraft crashed. Thousands of crewmen died or parachuted into hostile territory to face capture. The sound of metal tearing and explosions stayed with survivors for life. One American pilot recalled flying through flak so thick it blocked out the sun. He described 10 seconds of total darkness. It felt like a total eclipse. British planners ran the numbers. Attacking a zone with 488 batteries meant accepting a 12% casualty rate every single day. There was no mistake. The air war had become a meat grinder. Events accelerated toward the end. The ground shook. The sky burned. The guns finally went silent in May 1945. 4,000 feet in the air, protection was an illusion. The B-17 bombers offered almost no physical defense for the men inside. The aircraft were wrapped in thin aluminum skins. Armor plating only covered the most critical mechanical systems. Crewmen stood behind fragile metal walls that offered zero resistance against jagged shrapnel or high-pressure fuel lines. Engines and hydraulic systems remained equally exposed to enemy fire. But the casualties were not one-sided. Allied commanders analyzed the losses and changed their strategy. They turned fighter bombers into specialized hunter killers. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and Hawker Typhoons deliberately targeted anti-aircraft batteries. Their mission was simple: eliminate the guns to increase the survival odds for the heavy bombers. The footage from gun cameras shows the reality of these missions. Fighters swept miles ahead of the main formation. They dove toward the ground, strafing gun pits with .50 caliber rounds before the heavy bombers reached the drop zone. The bombers also fought back. Their own machine guns targeted any exposed German crews. The Allies developed specialized weapons for these suppressive strikes. They used cluster bombs designed to detonate in mid-air. These weapons showered flak positions with thousands of steel fragments. It was a war of attrition. The Allies were now using the same brutal logic the Germans had used against them. One German officer stood on a concrete fortress tower in Berlin and watched the sky. He saw American bomber streams pass through thick clouds of exploding shells. The planes did not break formation. They continued toward their targets and released their payloads with mechanical precision. Later, the Luftwaffe commander visited the same battery. His face showed no trace of the confidence seen after the fall of France. A fellow officer noted the change in his demeanor. He looked like a man who finally understood that the war was lost. He was behind the curve. The flak towers themselves were massive engineering feats. 8 of these major complexes rose above Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. These were concrete strongholds. The walls were thick enough to withstand direct hits from the largest Allied bombs. Inside, the towers held ammunition depots, hospitals, and supply rooms. Thousands of civilians huddled in the lower levels during raids. Their firepower was lethal. Heavy 12.8-centimeter twin mounts sat on the roofs. They were supported by 88-millimeter guns and rapid-fire light cannons for low-flying targets. But there was a problem. There were too few towers to create a true perimeter. Allied planners simply mapped the tower locations and ordered pilots to fly around them. By the end of 1945, these fortresses became isolated islands. They were among the final positions to surrender. Beyond the enemy fire, the equipment itself was a threat. Shells failed to launch or detonated prematurely inside the barrels. Crewmen suffered constant burns from scalding brass casings and overheated metal. There was also one danger that rarely appeared in the official reports. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. Gravity turned German defense into a dual threat. Thousands of steel splinters from exploding shells fell back toward the earth. These shards did not distinguish between Allied airmen and German gunners. They struck everything below. The professional Luftwaffe crews who started the war were dying off. By January 1943, the losses were unsustainable. The regime responded with a massive conscription order. Schoolboys were the new targets. Entire classes of boys born in 1926 and 1927 were drafted. Some were 15, others were 17. They received their papers and reported for duty in February. Within weeks, children were crewing heavy weapons in the middle of burning German cities. How did the military fill the gaps? They went even younger. By the end of the war, 14-year-olds operated heavy artillery. Some reports claim boys aged 12 and under were found at gun positions. American forces even took 8-year-olds into custody. In total, 200,000 boys served as flak helpers before the surrender. The footage shows the reality of their training. It was non-existent. One survivor described it as a rushed 2-week orientation at a live battery. Another recruit arrived in the morning and became a loader by the afternoon. These were not just assistants. They formed complete gun crews. They worked as gunners and loaders. They operated complex fire control computers. The physical strain was immense. One veteran served as a traverse gunner at age 16. The weapon was massive. He described the effort of tracking a target as trying to move the whole world. This was the labor of children. Women were the next resource. By 1943, over 100,000 young women joined flak units. They manned searchlights and fire control systems. By 1944, they moved directly to the guns. The situation became desperate. There was no one else left to fight. April 1945. Berlin was under siege. The city's defense batteries no longer looked like a professional army. Many anti-aircraft positions were operated entirely by women. Foreign laborers filled the remaining gaps in the crews. The Luftwaffe utilized approximately 100,000 Soviet prisoners of war. These men agreed to serve their captors to avoid a slow death by starvation in German labor camps. They wore German uniforms. They carried heavy ammunition crates to the guns. But they understood the stakes. If Germany lost, Soviet authorities would classify them as traitors and execute them immediately. Everyone in the bunkers knew the penalty for switching sides. How did the elite Luftwaffe reach this point? At first glance, it was a military branch. In reality, it was a desperate collection of civilians. By the final month of the war, nearly 50% of all anti-aircraft personnel were auxiliaries. This included industrial workers who manned the guns during night raids before returning to factory shifts at dawn. It included foreign nationals from Latvia and Croatia. It included teenagers who should have been in classrooms and elderly militia members. The professional military branch had vanished. It was replaced by a last-ditch force of the desperate. The casualty statistics tell the real story. During the Spanish Civil War, flak crew losses were already the second highest in the German military, surpassed only by fighter pilots. By 1943, half of the original crews were dead. During the next phase of the conflict, the death rate climbed to between 50 and 70%. In the final months, the mortality rate approached 80%. Some records suggest that only 1 out of every 5 German flak crewmen survived the war. Exact verification is difficult, but the physical evidence remains. The original trained soldiers were dead. Teenagers and elderly men were all that remained to pull the triggers. The footage from the era shows the cost of this replacement. Individual incidents provide the specific details. August 1944. 23 teenage auxiliaries from 4 different towns died in a single Allied airstrike. July 1944. 8 boys, aged 15 and 16, were killed instantly when an aerial mine struck their command post. October 1943. 23 high school students were vaporized when a bomb landed directly on their battery. January 1945. 17 more students died during a single attack on the city of Cologne. The sound of explosions replaced the sound of school bells. Events accelerated on the Eastern Front. The danger here was different. Soviet forces did not view underage boys as soldiers. They reportedly executed child combatants as irregular fighters, claiming they were not protected by the Geneva Convention. The Luftwaffe commander eventually issued a retreat order. He demanded the youngest auxiliaries be pulled back from the eastern lines. It was too late. Thousands had already been killed in the trenches. One officer's report survives from the final Soviet offensive. His entire battery was wiped out. The men were transported east by rail, watching their destroyed guns burn behind them. Apart from one man who managed to stay west of the river, the entire unit disappeared. The scale of the loss was unprecedented. Memorial records provide a final estimate. 100,000 child soldiers died during the final months of the conflict alone. The war had consumed an entire generation.